Okay, we're joined here by Jathan Sadowski to talk about ground truths and political orders. So thanks for your time, Jathan. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And you can learn more about Jathan's work with the links here. Host of a kind of very popular podcast, and your latest book kind of engages with these kind of things on a kind of, I would say, a more meta level in terms of what we're talking about today. But can you tell us a little bit about your research background, what you're up to today, and what kind of research you're doing?
Yeah, for sure. So my work broadly is on the political economy of technology, and I kind of have one foot in social sciences. That's my background, but I'm in a faculty of information technology. So I teach computer science and software engineering students largely, but really thinking about these relationships between social power and financial value and how they influence the kinds of technologies we have, why we have the kinds that we have, what they do in the world, for whose benefit. So that's really my work is like really trying to get this mechanical, technical understanding of the technologies to then use that to ask broader social critical questions about where they came from and who they work for.
Yeah, and so how do computer scientists go with the social science perspective that you bring?
I think they really enjoy it actually, right? Like, I don't think a lot of, I don't think most people go into studying technology because they are interested in technology in and of itself, like as this kind of fetish object, right? I think they go into studying technology because they're interested in the things it does in our lives, the things it could do in our lives,
Mm.
right? That is what interests them. And so I think they don't, computer science students don't get a whole lot of that in
Yep.
their degrees. And so I think classes that actually get them to think about the social context, the human values of the technology, it I think they really enjoy it. I get a lot of great feedback from students who, sometimes joke that I'm backdooring like a faculty of arts unit into
Yep.
a faculty of IT unit, but they say that lovingly. They actually really enjoy that.
That's good. That's great. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about the specific research you've been doing recently? You've had a few fellowships and particularly been looking at things like insurance.
Yeah, so pretty much all of my research right now is really focused on questions of risk governance. How do we construct knowledge about risk, especially around, climate change is a big thing that I'm researching right now, but also personal risk and how that then, that knowledge is constructed by industries like insurance, how, through techniques like actuarial science or machine learning, and then how that kind of knowledge about risk and how we assess, what risk is it for your health or for your driving, or how do we assess the risk of natural disasters and catastrophes, how that then goes into creating these larger regimes of governance in society, right? It's, our knowledge about risk not only informs what we think is going to happen in the future, but it importantly informs what we do in the present about what we think is going to happen in the future.
Yeah, yeah. In youth studies, we kind of position the kind of concept of the future as like a permanent absent presence in our life. It's like this thing that kind of we're looking forward to that has kind of profound effects on what we're doing today. So I think that kind of orientation towards the future is common amongst our fields. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, if you can convince people about what the future holds in some way, then that becomes a really powerful justification to do stuff in the present.
Mm.
And so the future as this kind of like, as this alibi for actions in the present is how I often think about it.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, and I think that's what's definitely going on with the kind of dominant of AI discourse in the world at the moment. We have these kind of huge companies and prominent people basically saying there's no alternate future. This is happening, and like in a way to kind of justify what they're doing at the moment, I suppose. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and so much of the financing around AI right now is based on what I call check kiting, right? Like, it's writing a check today, hoping the funds will be in the account in the future.
Mm.
So, that's basically the whole financing of tech companies right now is making promises about the future, cashing checks today on the basis of those promises, and then hoping that they can make something like what they say will happen actually happen.
Yeah, and these examples speak to this concept of epistemic politics, right? And like And the example that you're using there, like from an accounting point of view, it's very unlikely that many of those companies will be able to make back the investment, right, in terms of what they're currently doing and even projecting off into the future. So these, I suppose, almost mythical ways of pushing the future in terms of their own ends, is a form of kind of controlling this epistemic politics, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think mythical is a really good way of framing it, right? It's these kind of like cultural narratives that we have about technology and about the future that are really crucial and motivate a lot of material decisions in terms of politics, finances,
Yeah,
the creation of technology, right? So much technology we have is based on trying to approximate some kind of future, never quite getting there if we think about how the systems actually work, what their actual limitations are.
yeah,
But it kind of sets this end goal that then is framed as the only end goal that we can possibly be working towards. And it really does serve to eliminate a lot of alternatives.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so can you talk a little bit about this concept of epistemic politics, please? Like just define it a little bit so students can understand it a bit better.
For sure. So epistemic here or epistemology is really the study of how knowledge is constructed or how knowledge is made, right? Knowledge is not something that we like go pick like a fruit off of a tree outside or go find on the ground somewhere. Like knowledge is our understanding of the world around us. And we have to do that through data, through theories, through interpretation, through all kinds of things. And so epistemology or that kind of epistemic is really about this question of how knowledge is created. And then the politics there is a question of essentially about who gets to create knowledge and whose knowledge matters more than other people's knowledge and how does that knowledge do stuff in the world, right? Because it's also the fact that like there is no one real consensus reality in the sense that we all agree on the same exact interpretation of reality. And that's simply because we all have different positions. We all have different perspectives on the world. We all have different values that color our relationship to the world. And so we want to, we can look at the same piece of knowledge, you and I, but if we have different framings, different perspectives, different goals and motivations in mind, we can interpret that knowledge in radically different ways and use it to do radically different things. And so epistemic politics then is really this question of the kind of political fights we have, political and like the kind of small p, not necessarily in
Yeah,
government, but yes, also in government, but political in terms of like a contestation of values and visions for how the world should be organized and how that kind of organizes around these questions of knowledge.
yeah, yeah. That's a really good explanation. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the paper that I'm setting as a reading this week, and you're particularly interested in the way that actuarial science is important to risk governments and various industries, and how that relates to the technologies like learning model, large language models, and the like, and how this kind of relates to how we're governed in day-to-day life.
Yeah, and I think for me, this attention to actuarial science or these actuarial logics is really interesting, really important, and really overlooked in a lot of ways, right? It's like nothing is more cliche or stereotypically boring than like an actuary, right?
Yeah,
It is the most kind of I talk about insurance and actuarial science, which actuarial science is this kind of this study of risk, right? How do we predict risk? How do we assess it? How do we put a price on the probability of something happening or not happening, whether that's someone getting sick or a car crash, or maybe that's the destruction that comes from a typhoon in Brisbane, right? Like all of that is about risk, the probability of some hazard happening in the world, and then about how do we assess the price of that risk, what the actual loss is, and who's on the hook for
yeah.
those
Who has to
losses.
pay? Yeah,
Who has to pay exactly? And like, that kind of actuarial science, those kinds of methods really underpin everything, right? I talk about insurance as this thing that's in everyone's lives and on nobody's mind. Nobody thinks about it, nobody wants to think about it, but it is thinking about us all the time. It is making decisions about our lives all the time. And so for me, this makes it a really interesting and important area of study because it becomes this real kind of like foundation of power, of techno power in society, a form of governance, making decisions about our lives, structuring society, underpinning what can and can't happen in the
Mm.
world. But it's also one that nobody really pays much attention to. And that to me is the sweet spot of social scientific analysis.
Yeah, yeah, and I think your work really speaks well to the kind of technological progress or projections or trajectory or something about what's happened. And there's some other readings in the course that speak to that as well. And in the way that, like, from statistical analysis and actuarial logics, and now has been bringing in this, what I'm calling in the course, kind of algorithmic AI assemblages to, help with, creating risk understandings. Can you talk to a little bit about, like, how that process has happened and what it means for these kind of risk industries, but also, as the quote here kind of points out, how discrimination evolves in that kind of new technological system.
Yeah, for sure. And discrimination, well, I'll pick up there because I think when we talk about, you know, the problems with algorithmic bias, for example, or the harms that might come from an AI system, often the first thing we reach for in a social sense, at least, is discrimination, right? Some group being maybe privileged over some other group in a decision that, makes your lives better at the sake of someone else or instead of someone else, or maybe the opposite, right? Someone is targeted for exclusionary purposes in some way, in insurance, right? Maybe this is about who has their premium prices jacked up. Maybe not because of any thing that they're doing that increases their risk, other than that they are part of a group of people that are historically
Yeah,
marginalized in some sense. And we see this happening all the time. These debates are not, the far-flung past, but like are always currently happening in policy settings around, is discrimination on racial or gender lines happening in insurance or social services. And discrimination is interesting, though, because if we think about it from this point of view of actuarial science, right? Actuaries talk about discrimination as a neutral thing, right? Like without the ability to discriminate, there is no insurance
yeah,
industry, there is no finance industry, because you need to be able to, from the business's point of view, put people in categories and treat those categories differently. Uh, the question for them is, are these ways of discriminating done fairly and are they justified,
yeah,
right? And so discrimination is, from the actuary point of view, from the insurance company's point of view, is neither bad nor good, right?
yeah,
It's all about how you do it and why you do it.
yeah.
And I think that really makes our understanding a little bit more complex, where
Mm,
we can't, if we just say, well, your technology is discriminating, well, an insurer would say, yeah, and that's the whole point. And so now it becomes a question of, is that discrimination justified? How is that discrimination actually working in terms of the technologies, in terms of
yeah,
the social impacts? And so we can't just automatically use discrimination as, or bias as a bad thing,
mm,
because a lot of computer scientists, actuarial scientists will say, well, bias is just an inherent part of any data set. Discrimination is an inherent part of any actuarial technique. So then it makes us say, okay, what do we actually mean when we're talking about discrimination and
yeah,
bias?
yeah. Great. So, and I think that's a nice link into this kind of way that these technologies have ground truths, and based on various, the data in and all that kind of stuff. So, can you tell us a little bit about what that concept means and what that also means to what we're just discussing here? Yeah.
Yeah, so in a real technical sense, ground truth is the data set that we use to train and validate a model, right? And so like machine learning models, you have to train that model on data. And I think most people are kind of aware that, like, a lot of data has to go into a machine learning model to train it. We see this now with big AI systems like ChatGPT, where, it's often said that the whole internet is the training set for ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude. And so, you need a data set to train it, but you also need a data set to validate it, right? You need a data set to say, is this model doing what I want it to do? Is it recognizing the patterns I want it to recognize? Is it, is it true in some sense? And so what ground truth means and what it's supposed to kind of relate to is like, an understanding that the model is not a model is not reality. A model is a representation of reality. It's doing stuff with data about reality. And the ground truth is meant to be the thing that we hold as what the model is ideally trying to replicate.
Yep. Yep. Great. Okay. Cool. So I think, yeah, so with that in mind, and like I think this is kind of really good example for students to think about how these models are built. Can you kind of just take us through just quite quickly your example of the CatGPT in the paper?
Yeah, I was really proud when I came up with CatGPT to explain the process of ground truth because this really goes back to that question of epistemic politics as well. Ground truth is not something that just is like out there in the world. We can't have a perfect representation of reality in our data because data is inherently limited in some way. You're trying to represent parts of the world in terms of discrete numbers, right?
Mm.
Quantitative, discrete numbers, often maybe looking like, a CSV or comma separated variables file that's just a bunch of numbers strung together that are supposed to mean something. And so when you're talking about that, it's not like ground truth is like I'm taking this perfect snapshot of the world and then feeding that into my model. The epistemic politics there comes into how do we actually produce that ground truth? How do we choose what is going to represent the ground and the truth of that ground, and then use that to train a model that's then going to not only ideally try to replicate that, but then do that to use that ground truth to do other stuff in
Yep.
the world. And so and the CatGPT example is really about that production of ground truth. So, say we're training a machine learning model, an AI system to recognize cats. Well, you need to decide what ground truth for cats looks like, right? And so maybe this looks like scraping a data set of 100,000 images of cats from across the web. You do a bunch of searching of terms related to cats on Google Images or Tumblr or
Mhm.
X or wherever it might be. You gather all these images, and then what you need to do is then take those and a subset of that 100,000 images. You need to go and manually label them for as cats. You need as the slide says, you need to draw a picture. Usually it's like drawing a box around the cat in the image and saying this is a cat,
Mhm.
and that's telling the machine learning model this organization or this pattern of pixels represents cat in your model, because machine learning models don't actually like have any idea of what a cat is. They don't have ideas about anything, right? What they are is they're pattern recognition machines. And so when you're labeling the data in this way, you're saying this organization of pixels represents a cat.
Mhm.
And then this is a lot of work. This is what happens by click workers or grad students.
Yep. A lot of
Maybe
humans
in
in the
the
machine. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, these are the humans in the machine. And so there you have your training set, right? That kind of manually labeled set of images, and then the unlabeled set of images. Those together is the ground truth. So you
Yep.
feed then a random sample of your labeled images into your model, CatGPT, as a way to start training it. And then you're kind of adjusting the parameters of the model, trying to tweak it so that it recognizes the patterns in the way that you want it to. And so that's your training set. And so once you've done all that, you've kind of given the model a sense of what a representation of cattiness. All
Yeah.
these things are what are features of being a cat. And then you want to use the model to try to test it against images in your unlabeled set. So the images that don't have boxes drawn around them, they're just raw images, and that's your evaluation set. You're basically saying, has my model done a good job of being able to recognize cattiness
Yeah.
in these images? And so, I mean, that's essentially your ground truth, right? And then, there's a lot there to get into about like the construction of ground truth and, how questions of quality and accuracy.
Mm.
But I think what's really interesting to me is that so much of our discussion, whether it's as social scientists or as computer scientists, so much of our discussions about these technologies kind of ignore that point about ground truth and
Yeah.
that like the construction of a representation of reality, which then is the foundation for the whole technology, is largely taken for granted. So we don't really ask good questions about what actually goes into the ground truth. Where does it actually come from? Is the ground truth grounded? Is it truthy? Well, I don't know. We kind of take it for granted.
Or does it come from a data set that's had some kind of mission or function creep that moves it into a separate thing? There's all those kind of things. And I think on a previous slide, you mentioned, and it gives kind of you can talk through the language of mathematics when you have these things as kind of things that are deciding, and this gives it the kind of science kind of truth foundation does it that people tend to trust it in ways without kind of thinking about all the questions that you've just raised there, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. If you don't ask, and if you can't even ask hard questions about where the ground truth comes from, then you're kind of left with one of two options. Either take it for granted and trust it, or deny it, right?
Mm.
Say, well, I don't know why you're saying what you're saying or why the model is doing what it's doing, and therefore I don't trust it at all.
Yeah.
But I think weirdly, the default option is the first one, is to just say, well,
It is.
it's technology, it's science, it must be true because it's doing something that I can't understand, it's doing something really complex, and so I'm going to take it for granted.
Yeah, and at a kind of general societal level, I think that's mostly the case until you experience the kind of injustice or discrimination. Many people say in the robo-debt thing, we're experiencing a very big moment of epistemic politics there, right? Like, so that kind of stuff expresses how this kind of stuff can go wrong. Yeah, how the model doesn't fit the problem or the outcomes for sure. So in the slide here, you have out of the paper some stuff about like the various postmodern understandings of truth and how this kind of relates to data science. So I think we've kind of covered a lot of that already. I'll just move through to getting to the end here to sum up because we're starting to run out of time. I suppose I'd like, yeah, just to do you get to sum up what you think's most important about this area and like where you think things may be going next.
Yeah, and time really gets away from us. We could talk about this for so much longer. So
Yeah.
I really hope students go and read some of the paper, because I do think these things are really important. And then what I'm really trying to point us to is that yes, we need to pay attention to the effects of the technology, right? The kind of aftermath of algorithms is what I call it in the paper. But what we really need to do also is dive into the data sets, right? We need to actually really ask hard questions about not only what is this technology doing in our lives, but also where did it come from and why is it built the way it is? And this is an area that is, it's really hard to ask those questions because a lot of times the ground truth that underlies these systems is not available for investigation.
Mm.
The ground truth is kind of, it's hidden away, it's locked behind
Yeah.
corporate proprietary
Propriety.
systems,
Yeah.
or it's so big and so messy that no one actually knows what goes into it. And
Yeah.
and I think this is a real shocking truth of machine learning, is that the data sets required to create these models are so large. So that means the ground truth has to be so big that nobody actually has a good idea of what's inside of it.
Yeah.
And there's no incentive to know what's inside of it. I talk about in the paper that A lot of times the factors that go into creating ground truth is it good enough? Is it cheaply available? And is it doing what I want it to do in terms of like producing outcomes through my models?
Yep.
And I think we should have higher expectations when we talk about truth or ground truth, representations of reality in our models. We should have higher expectations for that because ultimately, I really like a quote by this sociologist Florian Jathan, who I quote in the paper. He says, we get the algorithms of our ground truth, right? At the end of the day, we get our technologies are only as good as the ground truth that was used to train, evaluate, and benchmark those technologies. And if we don't pay attention to that area, then we're really overlooking ultimately possibilities to create better technologies by having stronger foundations.
Yep. Excellent. I think that's a really good way to conclude. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah. So yeah, again, we'll stop it there, I think. Jathan, thanks so much for your time and really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Steve.